What if I told you that one of history's most decisive military victories wasn't won with cannons blazing or cavalry charging across blood-soaked fields? What if the greatest general of his age destroyed an entire army without firing a shot? In October 1805, somewhere between the winding Danube River and the medieval walls of Ulm, Napoleon Bonaparte achieved something that military theorists still study with obsessive fascination today. He didn't just defeat the Austrian army, he made them vanish. 30,000 soldiers surrendered without a major battle. An entire campaign collapsed not from violence, but from something far more terrifying, the complete paralysis of an enemy's will to fight. This is the story of how war was transformed from a contest of bloodshed into a battle of minds, where the real weapons were speed, deception, and the psychological destruction of hope itself. This is Ulm 1805, the campaign that changed warfare forever, and it happened in a way that seems almost impossible to believe. The question that haunts every military historian who studies this campaign is simple yet profound. How do you defeat an enemy who never gets the chance to fight back? The answer lies not in the thunder of artillery or the clash of steel, but in something far more subtle and devastating, the architecture of perfect strategy executed with machine-like precision. And to understand how Napoleon pulled off this masterpiece of military art, we need to go back to the moment when Europe was about to explode into war once again. The autumn of 1805 arrived in Europe with an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air people breathed. In the glittering ballrooms of Vienna, Austrian aristocrats danced with forced gaiety, knowing that their empire was about to gamble everything on a war they believed they could win. In the war rooms of London, British ministers pored over maps and financial ledgers, calculating how much gold it would take to build another coalition against the man who had crowned himself Emperor of France. And in a military camp stretching along the Channel coast of France, Napoleon Bonaparte stared across the gray waters toward England, his grand invasion plan crumbling in his hands. For 2 years, Napoleon had assembled the greatest invasion force Europe had ever seen. The Army of England, later renamed the Grande Armée, numbered over 200,000 men, drilled to perfection, waiting for the moment when French ships would control the Channel long enough to ferry them across to British soil. Napoleon had envisioned himself walking through the streets of London, dictating peace terms in Westminster itself. But the sea refused to cooperate. British naval supremacy, soon to be immortalized at Trafalgar, made the invasion a fantasy. The ships never came, the window never opened. And while Napoleon's soldiers practiced amphibious landings on French beaches, the map of Europe was being redrawn behind his back. Austria had been watching, waiting, and planning. After the humiliation of previous defeats at Napoleon's hands, the Habsburg Empire was determined to restore its dignity and power. The Austrian military command, led by the cautious and methodical Archduke Ferdinand and the elderly General Mack, Karl Mack von Leiberick, a man whose reputation far exceeded his actual abilities, believed they had learned from past mistakes. This time would be different. This time they had a plan. The Austrian strategy was built on a foundation that seemed solid: strike quickly into Bavaria, secure the alliance of the southern German states, and create a massive coalition army that would crush the French through sheer numerical superiority. Russian armies were already marching westward to join them. Prussian neutrality seemed likely to crack. Britain's gold would fund the entire enterprise. On paper, it looked perfect. But there was something the Austrians didn't fully comprehend, something that went beyond tactics and troop numbers. They were fighting a different kind of war than they understood, against a commander who had already moved beyond their conception of what warfare could be. Napoleon didn't just think about battles, he thought about campaigns as complete systems, where movement, supply, information, and psychological pressure were all weapons to be wielded with the same precision as a cavalry charge. And in the late summer of 1805, as diplomatic dispatches confirmed what his spies had been reporting for weeks, Napoleon made a decision that would echo through military history for the next 2 centuries. He would abandon the invasion of England entirely. He would pivot his entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of wagons, millions of pounds of supplies, from the Channel coast to the heart of Germany. And he would do it faster than anyone thought possible, moving with such speed that the enemy would be caught in a trap before they even realized the trap existed. The orders went out in late August with characteristic Napoleonic clarity and precision. 7 corps of the Grande Armée would march independently on separate routes, maintaining enough distance to avoid congestion, but close enough to support each other if needed. Each corps was a miniature army unto itself. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, all capable of independent operation. This was revolutionary. Traditional armies moved as single massive columns, slow and vulnerable. Napoleon's army would move like the fingers of a hand, separate but coordinated, capable of concentrating with devastating force at the critical moment. The soldiers packed their gear, wondering why they were suddenly marching east when England lay to the north. Most wouldn't understand the genius of what was about to unfold until it was already over. Meanwhile, in Bavaria, General Mack was executing his part of the Austrian plan with the methodical certainty of a man who believes he holds all the cards. By mid-September, Austrian forces had crossed into Bavaria and occupied the ancient city of Ulm, positioned on the Danube River. From Mack's perspective, this was the perfect position, astride Napoleon's most obvious invasion route, with good defensive terrain and positioned to link up with Russian forces advancing from the east. Mack estimated he had weeks, possibly months, before the French could threaten him. His intelligence reports suggested that Napoleon was still dealing with the aftermath of abandoning the English invasion, that French forces were dispersed and disorganized, and any major campaign was weeks or even months away from being feasible. Every assumption Mack made was logical, reasonable, and based on how wars had traditionally been fought. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong. Napoleon's army was already moving, and it was moving with a speed that seemed to violate the laws of military logistics. The soldiers marched in rain and mud, covering distances that military textbooks said were impossible for large formations. Soldiers who had trained for 2 years were in peak physical condition. The logistical system Napoleon had spent years perfecting allowed his army to live on the land while maintaining combat effectiveness. Local commandeered supplies supplemented organized supply trains. Cavalry screens prevented Austrian scouts from discovering the true scale and direction of the French movement. And Napoleon himself was everywhere, riding between corps, issuing detailed orders, maintaining an almost supernatural awareness of where every unit was and where it needed to be. The first Mack knew of the true danger came in late September, when confused reports began filtering into Ulm about French forces appearing in places they shouldn't be. Cavalry patrols reported large formations to the north, then to the west, then to the south. The reports didn't make sense. How could the French be in so many places simultaneously? Mack ordered reconnaissance missions, but Napoleon's cavalry screens intercepted them. Blind and confused, Mack remained in Ulm, waiting for clarity that would never come, and for Russian reinforcements that were still hundreds of miles away. He had no idea that he was already caught in one of the elegant traps in military history. Napoleon's strategy was breathtaking in simplicity and devastating in execution. While Austrian attention focused on the direct western approach to Ulm, the main French forces were sweeping in a massive arc to the north, crossing the Danube behind Mack's position, cutting him off from Vienna, from the Russian army, from any hope of retreat or reinforcement. 7 French corps converged like the blades of a closing scissors, each moving independently but timed with perfect precision to arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. The movement was so rapid, so unexpected, that Austrian commanders couldn't even agree on what was happening, let alone how to respond to it. By October 7th, the trap was closing, and Mack was beginning to understand the horror of his situation. French forces were behind him. The direct route back to Vienna was cut. The roads north were blocked. If he stayed in Ulm, he would be surrounded. If he tried to break out, he would have to fight through superior forces in unfavorable terrain. Every option led to disaster, and the window for effective action had already closed days ago. Panic began to spread through the Austrian command. Contradictory orders were issued and rescinded. Units were moved here and there with no coherent purpose. The paralysis that grips any organization when it realizes it has fundamentally misunderstood its situation settled over the Austrian army like a suffocating fog. Some Austrian units tried to escape. On October 11th, a force under General Wernick attempted to break out to the north, only to be intercepted and shattered by French cavalry. Another force tried to fight its way east and was driven back with heavy losses. With each failed attempt, the psychological noose tightened. Austrian soldiers began to understand what their commanders were slowly accepting. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered by an enemy who had destroyed them without landing a decisive blow. The genius of Napoleon's campaign lay precisely in this. He had positioned his forces so perfectly that fighting was unnecessary. The outcome was already determined by geography and logistics alone. Inside Ulm, the atmosphere became surreal. 30,000 Austrian soldiers crowded into a city that couldn't support them, eating through supplies that couldn't be replenished, watching French campfires multiply on the surrounding hills like the stars of some terrible constellation. Morale collapsed not through battle fatigue, but through the psychological weight of helplessness. These were professional soldiers, trained and equipped to fight, but given no opportunity to use their training or their weapons in any meaningful way. They had been defeated by mathematics and maps, by an enemy who understood war as a science of position and timing rather than a contest of courage and violence. Mack made one final attempt to extricate himself. On October 14th, he led a sortie out of Ulm in a desperate bid to punch through French lines. The attack was doomed before it began, badly coordinated, executed by troops whose morale was already broken against an enemy who had been expecting exactly this move. French forces absorbed the attack with minimal effort, then counterattacked, driving the Austrians back into Ulm with heavy casualties. That night, as rain fell on the city and wounded men filled every available building, Mack accepted what had become undeniable. He had lost. Not in battle, but in a contest he had never fully understood he was fighting. The negotiations for surrender began the next day. Austrian officers, their uniforms still immaculate despite the circumstances, met with French commanders to discuss terms. There was no triumphalism in these meetings, no gloating, just the professional courtesy of soldiers acknowledging military reality. The terms were surprisingly generous. Austrian soldiers would be allowed to return home as prisoners with the promise of eventual parole and exchange. Officers could keep their personal effects. The formalities would be observed. This wasn't brutality or conquest. This was a demonstration, a lesson in the new art of war that Napoleon had perfected. On October 20th, 1805, in one of the most dramatic scenes in military history, the Austrian army marched out of Ulm to formally surrender. 30,000 soldiers laid down their arms before an enemy who had never actually defeated them in pitched battle. French soldiers lined the roads, watching in disciplined silence as their opponents passed, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Napoleon himself attended the ceremony, not to humiliate his enemy, but to mark the significance of what had been achieved. He had proven that wars could be won through maneuver and psychology, that the highest form of military art wasn't the ability to win battles, but the ability to make battles unnecessary. But the story doesn't end with the surrender at Ulm. In fact, the most important part of the story is what this campaign revealed about the nature of warfare itself, and why military commanders are still studying these operations more than 2 centuries later. Because Ulm wasn't just a victory, it was a revolution in military thought that changed how wars would be fought forever. The immediate impact of Ulm rippled across Europe like a shock wave. In Vienna, the Austrian court received the news with stunned disbelief. An entire army gone, not destroyed in heroic battle, but simply erased. The psychological impact was devastating.
Austria's military reputation, already damaged by previous defeats, was now in ruins. The careful plans for a grand coalition army lay in tatters. Russian forces still marching westward suddenly found themselves exposed and vulnerable, advancing into a strategic situation that had fundamentally changed. In London, British ministers who had invested so much gold in building this coalition watched helplessly as their investment evaporated before the first major battle had even been fought. But for military theorists and officers trying to understand what had happened, Ulm posed a profound puzzle. How did Napoleon do it? What were the principles behind this seemingly impossible achievement? The answers, when they came, were both simple and revolutionary. Napoleon treated war not as a series of isolated battles, but as a coherent system where logistics, intelligence, speed, and positioning were all interconnected. He understood that an army's will to fight was as important as their ability to fight, and that destroying the enemy's will was often more efficient than destroying their soldiers. He grasped that in war, time and space were weapons just as deadly as cannons and bayonets. The campaign revealed principles that would echo through military doctrine for generations. The importance of interior lines, positioning your forces so they can concentrate faster than the enemy can react. The value of operational mobility, moving faster than your enemy expects or can match. The power of intelligence and reconnaissance, knowing where the enemy is while preventing them from knowing where you are. The psychological dimension of warfare, understanding that soldiers fight with their minds as much as their bodies, and that destroying hope is sometimes more effective than destroying formations. All of these concepts, now fundamental to military education, were demonstrated in their purest form at Ulm. But there was something else revealed in this campaign, something darker and more troubling. Ulm showed that war could be perfected into something almost mechanical, a science of destruction so refined that human courage and sacrifice became almost irrelevant. Those 30,000 Austrian soldiers who surrendered at Ulm were not cowards, they were professionals, trapped in a system that gave them no meaningful choices. They had been defeated not by superior bravery or even superior tactics, but by superior logistics and operational design. This raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of military honor and the role of individual will in modern warfare. If wars could be won through pure maneuver, what place was there for the traditional virtues of courage and sacrifice? Was this progress or tragedy? Napoleon himself seemed to understand the implications. In the years after Ulm, he would win even more spectacular victories. Austerlitz just weeks later, Jena, Friedland, Graugum. But he also seemed to recognize that the kind of perfect bloodless victory achieved at Ulm was rare, perhaps even unrepeatable. Most wars would still be decided by the brutal calculus of battle. Ulm was an exception, a moment of near-perfect execution that happened when every factor aligned correctly. It was a masterpiece, but masterpieces by definition cannot be mass-produced.
The Austrian general Mack became a scapegoat for the disaster. Court-martialed and imprisoned, his reputation destroyed. History has not been kind to him, portraying him as incompetent and foolish, but this judgment is perhaps unfair. Mack wasn't stupid, he was conventional. He fought the war he had been trained to fight, using the principles and assumptions that had worked for generations. His tragedy was facing an opponent who had moved beyond those principles into something new, and not recognizing the shift until it was too late. In this sense, Mack represents something larger than himself. He represents the fate of any system that fails to adapt when the fundamental rules change. For soldiers in the Grande Armée, Ulm was a source of immense pride. They had achieved the seemingly impossible, marching hundreds of miles at a crushing pace, maintaining discipline and effectiveness, executing complex maneuvers with precision, and forcing an enemy's surrender through sheer operational excellence. The campaign became legendary within the French army, a story told and retold to new recruits as an example of what could be achieved through training, discipline, and adherence to Napoleon's system. The emperor himself would later recall Ulm as one of his finest achievements, not because of the glory of battle, but because of the perfection of the maneuver. But for Austria and its allies, Ulm was a trauma that would shape strategic thinking for decades. The humiliation of the surrender sparked desperate attempts at military reform. Austrian officers studied Napoleon's methods obsessively, trying to understand the alchemy that had produced such devastating results. Some grasped the lessons. Future Austrian commanders like Archduke Charles would give Napoleon genuine trouble, but others never quite understood, continuing to fight using outdated principles and suffering repeated defeats as a result. The gap between those who adapted and those who didn't became a fault line in European military culture, separating the progressive from the traditional, the effective from the obsolete. The Russian army, watching from a distance as they continued their march westward, learned their own lessons from Ulm. Russian commanders understood that they were now facing an enemy who could destroy them before they even reached the battlefield if they weren't careful. This pushed Russian strategy toward caution and defensive positioning, avoiding the kind of exposed advances that had doomed Mack. When Russian forces finally met Napoleon at Austerlitz in December 1805, they approached the battle with wariness born from watching the destruction of their Austrian allies. It didn't save them. Napoleon won another crushing victory, but it showed that the psychological impact of Ulm extended far beyond the soldiers who actually surrendered. Across Europe, in military academies and staff colleges, the Ulm Campaign became required study. Generations of officers pored over maps, trying to understand the precise timing and positioning that had made the trap work. The campaign was dissected, analyzed, and debated endlessly. What emerged was a new understanding of operational art, the level of warfare between tactics, what happens in individual battles, and strategy, the overall conduct of the war. Ulm showed that campaigns could be won or lost at this operational level, that brilliant tactics and sound strategy weren't enough if operational execution was flawed. This insight would reshape military education and planning for the next 2 centuries. The campaign also revealed the increasing importance of staff work and systematic planning in modern warfare. Napoleon's success at Ulm wasn't improvised genius, it was the result of meticulous preparation, detailed logistics, clear orders, and careful coordination between independent units. The Grande Armée worked like a machine because Napoleon had spent years building and refining that machine, training his subordinates, standardizing procedures, creating systems that could function even when he wasn't directly present. This was perhaps the deepest lesson of Ulm, that military genius wasn't about individual heroism, but about building organizational systems capable of sustained excellence. In the broader sweep of history, Ulm marked a turning point in how Europeans understood warfare. The old assumption that wars would be decided by a few large, pitched battles was revealed as outdated. The new reality was that wars would be decided by campaigns, by logistics, by operational maneuver, by the ability to sustain military operations over time and space. This shift had profound implications not just for armies, but for states themselves. Countries that couldn't mobilize resources efficiently, couldn't move armies quickly, couldn't adapt strategically, would be at a fatal disadvantage regardless of how brave their soldiers were. Warfare was becoming industrialized, systematized, modern, and Ulm was one of the first clear demonstrations of this transformation. Yet, for all the analysis and study, there remains something almost inexplicable about the Ulm campaign. The precision of the execution, the perfection of the timing, the psychological collapse of an entire army. It all seems almost too good to be true, as if Napoleon had written a fiction of how warfare should work, and then somehow manifested that fiction into reality. Military historians still debate exactly how he pulled it off, what specific decisions made the difference, whether the outcome was inevitable, or whether the Austrians might have escaped if they had acted differently at certain critical moments. These debates will probably never be fully resolved because they touch on something fundamental about military genius itself, the ability to see possibilities that others don't, to take risks that seem insane until they work, to execute plans with a precision that verges on the supernatural. For the soldiers who marched away from Ulm as prisoners, the experience must have been profoundly disorienting. They had done everything they had been trained to do,
followed orders, maintained discipline, and still ended up defeated without the opportunity to truly fight. Some probably felt relief they had survived without the horror of battle. Others likely felt shame, the sense of having failed without even the dignity of honorable combat. These complex emotions rarely make it into historical accounts, which focus on commanders and strategies rather than individual experiences. But understanding those feelings matters because they reveal what Ulm really meant at a human level. The collision between individual courage and systemic failure, between personal honor and strategic helplessness. The civilians of Ulm witnessed history from an uncomfortable proximity. Their city became a stage for this drama, their streets filled with tens of thousands of soldiers, their resources requisitioned by both sides, their homes often commandeered for military purposes. For them, the fact that the campaign was bloodless was cold comfort. War's disruptions and demands were still very real. The surrender probably came as a relief, ending the uncertainty and allowing normal life to resume. But they too had learned a lesson about the nature of changing warfare, that battles could be won and lost in their city without their city becoming a battlefield, that modern war was about control and maneuver rather than just destruction. Napoleon's genius at Ulm highlighted a darker side of his military system, its dependence on his personal capabilities. The campaign worked because Napoleon could hold the entire operational picture in his mind, could coordinate 7 independent corps across hundreds of miles, could make instantaneous decisions based on fragmentary information, and could push logistics to their absolute limits. But this kind of capability couldn't be easily transferred or replicated. When Napoleon wasn't present, his subordinates often struggled to achieve the same results. This created a strategic vulnerability that would eventually contribute to his downfall. The very perfection of his system at Ulm contained the seeds of future problems. It was a system built around genius, and genius can't be institutionalized. The broader political implications of Ulm rippled through Europe for years. The ease with which Napoleon had dismantled an Austrian army terrified other continental powers. Prussia, watching nervously from the sidelines, began to reconsider its neutrality. The smaller German states, caught between French power and Austrian influence, adjusted their allegiances based on this clear demonstration of French superiority. Russia, despite its own vast resources, recognized that defeating Napoleon would require more than just numerical superiority. It would require fundamentally different strategic thinking. Britain, safe behind its naval moat but committed to preventing French hegemony, poured even more gold into coalition building, knowing that conventional military responses weren't enough.
The campaign also accelerated the transformation of warfare from an aristocratic enterprise to something more modern and bureaucratic. The old model, where wars were fought by professional armies at the direction of kings and nobles, was giving way to something new. Mass mobilization, national identification with military success, war as an instrument of state policy rather than dynastic ambition. Napoleon embodied this transition. He was a product of revolutionary France, risen through merit rather than birth, leading armies that represented, at least in theory, the nation rather than just the ruler. Ulm demonstrated that this new model could defeat the old one decisively, that organization and efficiency could overcome tradition and noble leadership. The implications would echo through the 19th century and beyond. For military professionals, Ulm became both an inspiration and a burden. It set a standard of operational excellence that was almost impossible to match. Every commander who studied the campaign inevitably compared their own operations to Napoleon's masterpiece and found them wanting. This created a kind of Napoleonic complex in military culture, a simultaneous worship of and intimidation by Napoleon's achievements that could be paralyzing rather than instructive. How do you learn from perfection? How do you apply lessons from an operation that succeeded partially because of unique circumstances that might never be replicated? These questions haunted military education for generations. The Austrian military underwent painful reforms in response to Ulm and subsequent defeats. They couldn't simply copy Napoleon's methods. that would have required transforming Austrian society and political structures in ways that were impossible within the Habsburg system. Instead, they had to find their own path to military effectiveness, adapting what they could from French methods while preserving what worked in Austrian military culture. This process was slow, incomplete, and often frustrating, but it did eventually produce a more effective Austrian military. The trauma of Ulm became a catalyst for change, even if that change took decades to fully manifest. As the 20th century dawned and warfare entered new technological and industrial dimensions, military theorists between the world wars, developing the concepts that would become blitzkrieg, looked back to Napoleon's operational methods as precursors to their own ideas about rapid, decisive campaigns built around mobility and psychological shock. The famous encirclement battles of World War II, the German victories in France in 1940, the Soviet operations at Stalingrad and in Operation Bagration, all echoed Napoleon's methods at Ulm, adapted to industrial-age technologies. The core insight remained the same. Position your forces so perfectly that the enemy's defeat becomes inevitable without a decisive battle, then force their surrender through the logic of hopelessness rather than the mechanics of destruction. Modern military doctrine still references Ulm when discussing operational maneuver. The campaign appears in staff college curricula, in strategic planning documents, in debates about military transformation. The questions it raises: how do you achieve decision without battle? How do you coordinate complex operations? How do you maintain the psychological pressure necessary to break enemy will? Remain central to military thinking. In an age when the cost of major battles has become potentially civilization-ending, the idea of achieving victory through maneuver rather than attrition has renewed urgency. Ulm offers a model, albeit one from a very different technological and political context, for thinking about how this might be possible. Yet the campaign also serves as a warning. The perfection of Ulm was never repeated, not even by Napoleon himself. His subsequent campaigns would feature plenty of hard fighting, bloody battles, and uncertain outcomes. The idea that wars can be won purely through maneuver without the test of combat proved to be a mirage, appealing, occasionally achievable under special circumstances, but not a general principle that could be reliably applied. Most conflicts still come down to the brutal fundamentals of who can endure more, who can sustain their military effort longer, whose political will remains intact when the costs mount. Ulm was exceptional precisely because it was an exception. For contemporary students of history, Ulm offers lessons that extend beyond the purely military realm. The campaign demonstrates how organizational excellence can overcome numerical superiority, how psychological factors can be as important as material ones, how innovation often comes from those willing to challenge conventional wisdom, how perfect execution requires careful preparation and the ability to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. These insights apply to business, to politics, to any competitive endeavor where strategy and execution determine outcomes. Ulm has become a case study not just in military history, but in leadership and organizational effectiveness more broadly. The human dimension of Ulm, the experiences of the soldiers who marched hundreds of miles, the officers who watched their careful plans collapse, the civilians caught in the middle, reminds us that even bloodless victories have real costs. The Austrian soldiers who surrendered didn't spare trauma simply because they didn't fight a pitched battle. The psychological impact of helplessness, of professional failure, of watching your army dissolve without the dignity of combat was its own form of wound. The French soldiers who achieved this masterpiece paid their own price in exhaustion and hardship during the march. War, even when it achieves its objectives with minimal violence, remains fundamentally destructive of human well-being and potential. Today, as we look back across more than 2 centuries at the events of October 1805, the campaign retains its power to fascinate.
In an age of instant communication and real-time satellite imagery, the idea that an entire army could be maneuvered into helplessness seems almost quaint. Yet the fundamental principles remain relevant. Modern military operations still require coordination across multiple formations, still depend on intelligence and surprise, still involve the psychological dimension of breaking enemy will. The technologies change, but the core challenge, how to defeat an enemy as efficiently and decisively as possible, remains constant.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
For those 30,000 Austrian soldiers who laid down their arms outside Ulm, the campaign represented a peculiar kind of historical irony. They had been defeated without dishonor, destroyed without being given the chance to fight. Their surrender was not a betrayal of military values, but a logical response to an impossible situation. Yet history remembers them primarily as the victims of Napoleon's genius, their role reduced to being the object lesson in someone else's masterpiece. There's something tragic in this. These were real men with their own stories, their own families, their own hopes and fears, reduced in historical memory to mere props in a demonstration of operational brilliance. The commanders who surrendered at Ulm, particularly General Mack, deserve more nuanced treatment than they often receive. They weren't fools or incompetents. They were products of a military system that had worked for generations but was being rendered obsolete by Napoleon's innovations. Their failure was a systemic failure, a clash between old and new paradigms of warfare, where the old was inevitably going to lose. Scapegoating individuals for systemic failures is a timeless human tendency, but it obscures the deeper lessons about how military organizations adapt or fail to adapt to fundamental changes in the nature of warfare. Napoleon's achievement at Ulm can also be seen as the culmination of years of experience and preparation. It wasn't a sudden stroke of genius, but the fruit of continuous learning and improvement over time. Every campaign Napoleon had fought since his first command in Italy in 1796 had taught him something about operational movement, about logistics, about reading enemy intentions, about the psychology of soldiers and commanders. Ulm represented the perfection of a method that had been developing for nearly a decade. This is an important lesson in itself, that excellence in any field comes from systematic learning and improvement over time, not from isolated moments of inspiration. The political context of Ulm also matters for understanding its significance. The campaign was fought at a moment when European balance of power hung in the balance, when Napoleon's empire was still expanding, and it wasn't yet clear whether any coalition could effectively resist French dominance. Ulm answered that question decisively, at least in the short term. No conventional military response could stop Napoleon in his prime. This realization shaped European politics for the next decade, driving the desperate search for new strategies, new technologies, new forms of resistance that might succeed where traditional armies had failed. The economic dimension of warfare, illuminated so clearly at Ulm, would become increasingly central to military success in the industrial age. Napoleon's ability to move and supply his army more efficiently than his opponents gave him a decisive advantage. But this efficiency required resources, money, administrative capacity, infrastructure, political organization. France's military dominance in this era was built on the economic and administrative reforms of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. Ulm demonstrated that modern warfare was becoming a contest not just of military skill, but of state capacity, the ability to mobilize, organize, and sustain military power over time. As we reach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on why Ulm continues to captivate us more than 200 years after the event. Part of the fascination lies in the sheer elegance of Napoleon's solution to the strategic problem he faced. Like a perfectly executed chess combination or a mathematical proof, the campaign has an aesthetic quality that transcends its immediate military significance. It represents human intellect and organizational capacity functioning at their highest levels, producing an outcome that seems almost too perfect to be real. But there's something unsettling about Ulm, something that speaks to deeper anxieties about modern warfare and modern society. The campaign showed that individual courage and traditional military virtues could be rendered irrelevant by superior organization and planning. It foreshadowed a future where wars would be decided more by industrial capacity and logistical efficiency than by the qualities that military cultures had traditionally celebrated. In this sense, Ulm was not just a military victory, but a symbol of modernity itself, rational, systematic, impersonal, and terrifyingly effective. The Austrian soldiers who surrendered at Ulm walked away to eventually return home, most surviving the war to tell their grandchildren about the time they were defeated without fighting. For them, the campaign became a story of survival, of enduring an impossible situation with dignity, of learning hard lessons about how the world was changing. Their perspective, rarely centered in historical accounts, reminds us that every great strategic victory involves thousands of individual human experiences, each with their own meaning and significance. For Napoleon, Ulm was vindication of his methods and his vision of warfare. In the years following the campaign, he would reference it frequently as proof that his system worked, that his approach to military operations was superior to traditional methods. Yet even Napoleon couldn't replicate Ulm's perfection. His later campaigns would feature brilliant victories at Austerlitz and Jena, but also costly battles like Eylau and Aspern-Essling, and ultimately catastrophic defeats in Russia and at Leipzig. The lesson, perhaps, is that perfection in warfare is ephemeral, achieved only when every factor aligns correctly, and that most military operations will involve messiness, mistakes, and hard fighting, regardless of how brilliant the commander.
The strategic landscape that produced Ulm, continental European powers fighting for dominance with professional armies moving on foot, communicating by courier, supplied by wagon trains, has vanished. Yet the intellectual heritage of the campaign persists. Modern military officers still study Ulm, still try to extract principles that might apply to contemporary operations, still debate what made it work and whether similar results could be achieved today. This persistent relevance speaks to something fundamental in Napoleon's achievement. He didn't just win a campaign, he demonstrated timeless principles about how organized human effort can achieve objectives through planning, coordination, and psychological insight. The memory of Ulm has been preserved in countless ways, in military histories, in strategic doctrine, in war games and simulations, in academic debates and professional military education. Each generation rediscovers the campaign and finds new meanings in it, viewing it through the lens of their own military challenges and strategic concerns. This living tradition of engagement with Ulm ensures that the campaign remains not just historical curiosity, but active part of how military professionals think about their craft. For those of us who study history from the comfort of peaceful times, Ulm offers a window into a world where strategic genius could determine the fates of nations, where organizational excellence could achieve what seemed impossible, where human intellect operating at its highest levels could shape the course of European history. It reminds us that ideas matter, that planning and preparation matter, that excellence in execution matters, whether in military affairs or any other human endeavor. The specifics of early 19th century warfare may be obsolete, but the principles that Napoleon demonstrated at Ulm retain their power. The ultimate lesson of Ulm might be this, that war at its highest level is fundamentally about creating situations where the enemy has no good options, where every choice they make serves your purposes, where defeat becomes inevitable not through violence but through logic. Napoleon achieved this perfect trap in October 1805, creating a masterpiece of operational art that has never been surpassed. It was a victory won not with cannons and cavalry charges, but with maps and mathematics, with timing and logistics, with psychological insight and organizational excellence. It proved that the greatest military achievements come not from destroying the enemy, but from making their destruction unnecessary, from winning without fighting. And so the Austrian army marched out of Ulm and laid down their weapons, not because they were cowards or because they were beaten in battle, but because continuing to fight had become pointless. They had been defeated by something they barely understood, by an enemy who had moved beyond their conception of how wars should be fought. Their surrender was the acknowledgement of a new reality, that warfare had transformed, that the old rules no longer applied, that the future belonged to those who understood war not as a contest of courage, but as a science of victory. This was the revolution that Napoleon had wrought, and Ulm was its most perfect demonstration. The silence before the storm had been deafening, and when it finally broke, an entire army had vanished not into death, but into obsolescence, swept away by the relentless logic of a perfectly executed plan.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.